The intellectual, political, and religious forces of the Renaissance only intensify in 17th century Europe. Tension between Protestants and Catholics continues, with Catholicism maintaining prominence in the South and Protestantism gaining control in Northern Europe. The 17th century also sees an increase in trade and a subsequent increase in wealth, meaning that churches and state institutions are still important artistic patrons, but now we have this newly prosperous middle class to provide alternative patronage. Additionally, the 17th century is an age of scientific advancement. Discoveries like those of Copernicus, who discovered that the Earth is not at the center of the universe, but just one of several planets revolving around the sun, also challenged and broadened existing world views. What developed out of this context is a style we refer to as the Baroque. The term Baroque comes from the Italian word barocco, which is a jeweler's term for an irregularly shaped pearl. So it sort of describes something that is beautiful and fascinating, yet strange and different. Artists will continue to be influenced by Renaissance ideals, such as idealization based on observation of the material world, and they will continue to draw on similar subject matters such as religious scenes and references to ancient Greece and Rome. But where the Renaissance stressed calm, logical reason, the Baroque is intentionally dramatic and deliberately evokes intense emotions. The Baroque style is characterized by drama, energy, and emotion. Compositions are balanced, though often asymmetrical, and they include implied motion, often diagonally through space. You'll also notice rich, harmonious colors and usually rather dramatic lighting with strong contrasts between light and dark. Additionally, 17th century artists will sort of seek to engage their viewers more directly by incorporating or activating the space surrounding the work and the viewer. In 17th century Italy, art was often used to revitalize the Roman Catholic Church, and the Baroque style, with its sort of dramatic and often opulent or spectacular visual effects, was perfect for this, and it was really used to heighten the emotional involvement of worshippers. One major goal of the Catholic Counter-Reformation was the proper embellishment of churches and their settings. And the popes of this period had an incredibly large amount of wealth, but they nearly bankrupted the church with their numerous expansive building programs. Pope Sixtus V, who was the pope from 1585 to 1590. He added long, straight avenues to the city of Rome that linked major pilgrimage churches together and linked them to the main city gate. He also ordered the creation of open spaces called piazzas in front of major churches, and he marked each site with an Egyptian obelisk. Sixtus also renovated the Vatican and its library, he built several new palaces, and he completed the Dome of St. Peter's. Now, Baroque architecture continues to conform to Renaissance ideals. We'll see classical arches, columns, colonnades, porticos, and domes, but generally these elements are grander, they're more exaggerated and sort of dramatic and theatrical in this Baroque period, and we'll also see the use of sort of undulating continuous curves. The 17th century sees not only the completion of the Dome of St. Peter's, but the structure also gets sort of a facelift. So remember that the original structure was built by Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor in the 4th century. Then in 1506, because it was in such a sad state of disrepair, Pope Julius II had it demolished, and he commissioned Bramante to rebuild it. And Bramante's design shows the preference of Renaissance architects for centrally planned churches that sort of recall shrines for saints or mausoleums of early Christians. But unfortunately, Bramante died shortly after beginning the project, and Raphael was hired to complete his plans. Later, in 1546, Pope Paul III commissioned Michelangelo to complete the construction, so he comes in and sort of simplifies Bramante's plan and redesigns the facade of the structure with a high Renaissance flair. So here we are about a half century later, in 1606 and 1607. Pope Paul V Borghese commissioned Carlo Maderno to renovate the church. Instead of the existing central plan, the Counter-Reformation called for a basilica-style church with long, wide naves that could accommodate large congregations for sermons and for Mass. So Maderno comes in and he lengthens the nave and kind of creates more interior space, but he also designed a new facade, which includes 3 progressive planes that sort of step forward. The first of them kind of reaches from the corners to the doorways. Then we have from the doorways kind of over to the area flanking kind of the central doorway area. And then, of course, the central doorway itself. Now, remember, these sort of progressively step outward, so the ends of the building are sort of further away than the center of the building, in this view at least. Now, also near the corners here, we have these large kind of flat square pilasters, but then around the doorways we have these fully rounded columns which support this continuous entablature that sort of steps out as the facade moves outward as well. So when Maderno died in 1629, his colleague Gian Lorenzo Bernini took over as the official architect for the Vatican. Bernini was a classicist, and he was very much indebted to the Renaissance, but he really broke through those traditions as well, and he becomes kind of the quintessential Baroque architect and artist. Bernini was tasked by Pope Urban VIII to create St. Peter's Square, this large sort of double piazza that made the approach to the basilica more awe-inspiring. Now, Pope Sixtus had already overseen kind of the clearing of this space in front of St. Peter's, but he had left Bernini with sort of this irregularly shaped space that had an Egyptian obelisk and some fountains that needed to be incorporated into his design. So Bernini chose to surround this open space with 2 huge porticos or kind of covered walkways that use Tuscan columns, which is sort of a Roman variant of column. But these porticos extend outward from the facade, and then they sort of curve around to enclose this oval piazza. Now, Bernini characterized his design as, quote, the motherly arms of the church reaching out to embrace the faithful and reunite heretics. So he's certainly still being influenced by classical and Renaissance architecture, which is certainly evident in kind of the balanced symmetry of his design, the perfect geometry, and the use of classical architectural elements. But he's also been inspired by the religious context of the Counter-Reformation and the efforts of the Catholic Church to sort of bring back those who had broken away. Now, around the same time, Urban VIII asked Bernini to design an enormous baldacchino, or this sort of huge bronze canopy to stand over St. Peter's altar inside the cathedral. Bernini completed this project in 1633, and this huge bronze structure is roughly 100 feet tall, and it combines aspects of both architecture and sculpture to sort of bring this dramatic focus to the altar. Now, the canopy itself is supported by these giant corner columns with sort of undulating spirals and curves. These are meant to symbolize the union of Christianity with the Jewish tradition. The columns themselves relate to the Jewish Temple of Solomon, and grapevines climbing up them reference the Christian Eucharist. Now, the entablature is topped with a sphere, which is representative of the earth or maybe the universe, and then a cross, which symbolizes the rule of Christ. The entablature is further decorated with figures of angels and putti, and it's hung with these tasseled panels that sort of simulate a cloth canopy. Bernini also includes references to Pope Urban VIII here and his family. He includes honeybees and suns on these tasseled panels, and then he includes laurel leaves on the vines that kind of wind around the columns, all of which were associated with Urban VIII and his family. So this sort of imposing structure, it not only marks the location of St. Peter's tomb and the altar, and it sits directly below Michelangelo's impressive dome, but it also sort of serves to reassert the supremacy of the Catholic Church. And additionally, in accordance with the sort of redefined doctrines of the Counter-Reformation, the Church had begun emphasizing more individualized relationships with God. And so this structure then acts as sort of a bridge between the monumentally scaled church architecture and the scale of the individual human worshiper inside of it. So before Bernini became the Vatican architect, he was a painter and a playwright, but he'd really made his name as a sculptor. He ran a large workshop with lots of assistants, and he continued to accept sculptural commissions from both the church and private clients. Bernini's work here, this is his David, was commissioned for Pope Paul V's nephew in 1623. This is a roughly 5-foot 7-inch marble sculpture that demonstrates a new style of three-dimensional composition that really sort of intrudes kind of forcefully into the viewer's space. So unlike Donatello's sassy, victorious boy or Michelangelo's contemplative hero, Bernini's David is shown in the dramatic moment of action. His feet are sort of firmly planted, yet he is in motion. He bends at the waist as he sort of twists back, reaching across the contour of his own body to gather his strength and launch this rock at his unseen enemy. And by creating this twisting figure, Bernini captures continuous motion, or maybe sort of a sequence of moments and poses. And so his David is all tension, action, and determination. He has removed his armor, revealing his lean, sort of muscular form. However, his lower body remains covered, demonstrating a certain sense of modesty. And also notice how, as the fabric sort of responds to the movement of the body beneath it, it creates this diagonal drape that sort of echoes the diagonal strap of this pouch that runs across his chest. And then both of these kind of run in the opposite direction of the diagonal of his arm. So Bernini really is using these interlocking and crossing diagonals to enhance the sense of tension and encourage the viewer to sort of move around the work and see all of its elements. Yet also notice sort of the concentration and the focus in his expression. He has this tightly knit brow and clenched mouth. He is, again, concentrating, and he's calm while doing so. He's very much fixated on his unseen enemy, whose implied presence kind of somewhere behind the viewer helps to further activate the surrounding space and bring the viewer into the action. One of Bernini's first major commissions through his workshop was this, a work titled Apollo and Daphne, created in 1622 to 25, when the artist was about 26 or 27 years old. The subject matter here is a story from ancient mythology. Now, Christian subject matter is still sort of predominant in the Baroque period, but we do have that love for classical antiquity that is sort of prevailing. Artists like Bernini really liked these subjects because they were typically dramatic, violent, and even erotic, and they could really push the boundaries of social acceptability and the limits of the Baroque style. So here Bernini is depicting a pivotal moment, sort of frozen in time, from the mythological drama about Apollo, the god of music and poetry and the sun, and Daphne, a wood nymph and celibate huntress of Artemis. So in the story, Apollo insults Eros, or Cupid, who takes his revenge by orchestrating this scene of unrequited passion and possession. He shoots a golden arrow into Apollo, which makes him fall desperately in love with Daphne. Then Cupid embeds a lead arrow into Daphne, enhancing the repulsion that she feels towards her pursuer. Daphne flees from Apollo's hungry advances, calling out to her father, the river god Peneus, for some help. and he hears her and takes mercy upon her. So, at the very moment that Apollo catches up to Daphne, she sacrifices her human body and assumes the form of a laurel tree to escape him. Now, remember, Baroque artists like Bernini had sort of broken away from Renaissance tenets of stability and order. Instead, Bernini is sort of exploring asymmetry, deliberate imbalance, and implied motion, all to sort of capture a single, very pivotal moment of this narrative. He sort of emphasizes the in-the-round quality of this work, again, sort of encouraging the viewers to move around the sculpture and see all of the elements and details. So in his composition, this is the moment in which Apollo has just caught up to Daphne, and she has started to shapeshift from a woman into a tree. The action and the motion of the moment are conveyed, again, with this series of sort of repeating diagonal and arcing lines. One of Apollo's legs kind of trails out behind him, as does this billowing drapery that is kind of flowing off of his shoulder and his back here, which, both imply that he's still sort of moving forward. Daphne's hair and kind of her outstretched arms imply her desperately kind of leaping through the space, while her facial expression communicates terror and disgust. Apollo reaches for her waist just as it's beginning to take the form of bark, while roots are sort of sprouting from her toes and leaves are erupting from her flowing hair. One art historian, Andrea Bolland, describes Daphne's expression as sort of seeming to betray her transformation. She says, "The fear of being caught gives over to horror at the means by which she will avoid capture." Bernini seems to sort of emphasize Apollo's savage sexual appetite through the motions as well. The god's hands sort of flex greedily, and his robes really threaten to sort of slip off his waist and expose him, and we have this spray of leaves sort of sprouting from Daphne pointing to his waist or his groin. Now, scholars generally agree that Bernini was likely inspired by the ancient poet Ovid's version of this story, in which even after Daphne transforms into the laurel tree, Apollo does not give up. Ovid wrote, "He loved her still. He placed his hand where he had hoped and felt the heart still beating, under the bark, and he embraced the branches as if they were still limbs and kissed the wood." Ovid also wrote, however, that Daphne still resisted, he says, and the wood shrank from his kisses. Now, this work by Bernini is somewhat similar to Giambologna's Mannerist abduction of the Sabine woman from the High Renaissance period, but both of them have sort of this twisting vertical composition. However, Bernini really introduces this new sense of disorder, confusion, and instability. Between 1642 and 1652, Bernini worked on an extensive commission to decorate the Cornaro family funerary chapel in the Roman church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. The funerary chapel was dedicated to Saint Teresa of Avila, a 16th century Spanish nun who had received multiple visions from God and had been canonized as a saint about 20 years earlier. The walls of the chapel are covered in multicolored marble panels, crowned with a projecting cornice on marble pilasters. The design here is clearly inspired by classical and Renaissance architecture, but with a new sort of Baroque sense of opulence and drama. At the center of the chapel, above the altar, we have this large oval niche framed with columns. Within this niche, Bernini's figures, cut from a large mass of marble, are supported by a pedestal that's fastened to the wall with hidden bars, so the entire scene seems to sort of hover in midair. The figural group, which is typically titled The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, depicts a specific vision in which an angel appeared to Teresa and stabbed her several times in the heart with a flaming spear. Now, her writings included several rather erotic descriptions of this event, and she discussed how the intense pain left her, quote, utterly consumed by the great love of God, end quote, and it sort of transported her to this state of religious ecstasy. So Bernini is showing us the moment just after the angel has stabbed Teresa with the spear. He's sort of pulling the spear back here. But both figures seem to sort of float upward, and the angel sort of leans back gracefully and sort of smiles sweetly down at Teresa's swooning body as she moans in agony. And this is really, a great demonstration of Bernini's mastery at capturing the movements and emotions of the figures, as well as his skill at sort of simulating different textures and colors in pure white marble. Notice how the angel's clothing is very lightweight, sort of silky or gauzy, and it kind of clings to the figure, whereas Teresa's robe is this sort of heavy woolen fabric, and it really, covers her body with this complex configuration of folds. And Bernini has kind of expertly used that to imply her sensuous figure beneath, even though we really only see her hands and her feet and her face. To each side of the chapel, Bernini included faux theater balconies or boxes, carved in very high relief, and these feature marble portrait sculptures of the Cornaro family, portrayed rather naturalistically and casually. Here on the right side of the altar, we have a couple of them who are sort of turning and leaning towards each other so that they can kind of talk about the event that they're witnessing below. And then another of them sort of turns the other way and kind of leans out over the balcony to watch more closely. I believe on the opposite side we have, again, 3 or 4 figures who are interacting with one another. A couple of them are reading books, etc. But these are sort of strikingly lifelike, and notice that the sort of high relief space behind them is even designed in this sort of classical Renaissance architectural style. So Bernini really combines sculpture and architecture to depict this very critical and dramatic moment from Teresa's life. Also notice that within this niche, Bernini has incorporated these sort of golden rays behind the figures, which reflect the natural light that streams into the niche from exterior windows that are kind of up here above it in the space that we can't see. And so this creates this kind of glowing heavenly aura around the mystical scene and kind of further enhances the intensity, emotionality, and sensuality of the deeply spiritual moment. Now, Bernini was not, intentionally creating a theatrical scene simply for the sake of spectacle. Rather, he's really trying to engage his viewers and inspire personal devotion to God in accordance with the Counter-Reformation ideas. So let's return to Italian Baroque architecture for a moment. So again, Pope Sixtus V had added 2 long straight avenues to the city of Rome. At the intersection of these avenues, city planners created a sort of visual emphasis by installing fountains in all 4 corners of the crossing. Then, in 1634, Trinitarian monks commissioned the construction of the Church of San Carlo al Quattro Fontane, or St. Charles at the 4 Fountains. They commissioned Francesco Borromini, who was the nephew of Carlo Maderno and who had previously worked under Bernini at St. Peter's. So San Carlo was Borromini's first major solo commission, and it was somewhat of a challenge. The lot that he had to work on was small and irregular, and his design would need to account for the existing fountains in the corners. Now, Borromini sort of solved these issues by creating an elongated central plan that has sort of undulating walls that alternate between concave and convex. The facade includes large columns that support a massive continuous entablature with decorative balustrades and cartouches. Deep concave and convex niches create a dramatic play of light and shadow over the organic surface, implying this sense of pulsing motion. He's also added a strong vertical thrust kind of here in the center of the facade, by kind of placing this tall doorway below this statue-filled niche, and then we have a window in a niche kind of covered with a canopy, and then we have this giant kind of shield-shaped element, which is a cartouche, kind of crowned with this balustrade, and it's very pointed kind of right here at the top. And that, we can't really see it here, but that point kind of continues to direct our eye upward towards the lantern on the central dome. So here we are standing in the sanctuary looking toward the altar, and you can really see that, we have, again, this kind of undulation of the walls as we alternate from kind of concave areas to convex areas. And so that really reflects the elongation of his central plan. And so above all this hovers this impressive oval dome. The geometric coffers on the interior of the dome create sort of an interesting honeycomb of crosses, hexagons, and octagons. The coffers sort of decrease in size as they near the apex of the dome, where the Holy Spirit dove hovers. In the lower coffers, and in the lantern, windows sort of allow natural light to stream in, and they reflect off the bright white surface, which again creates this sort of interesting play of light and shadow that has this dematerializing, ethereal, or heavenly effect. Painting in 17th century Italy tended to follow one of two main paths, either the ordered classicism of the Carracci family from Bologna, or the very dramatic naturalism of Caravaggio from Milan. Now, all of these artists ended up working in Rome, and all of them were schooled in the northern Italian Renaissance traditions like chiaroscuro, sfumato, and rich sort of Venetian coloration as well, but they all sort of approach painting in different ways. Brothers Agostino and Annibale Carracci and their cousin Ludovico shared a studio in Bologna. They sort of sought to fuse their northern roots with the high Renaissance emphasis on line, compositional structure, and figural solidity. They really looked to Raphael, Michelangelo, and sculpture from classical antiquity for their ideal figure types and expressive but restrained compositions. In 1582, they opened a short-lived but influential art academy for students to study art theory, Renaissance painting, antique classical sculpture, and to learn to draw from live models. The Carracci placed a high value on accurate drawing, complex figural compositions, complicated narratives, and technical virtuosity in both oil and fresco painting. In 1595, Annibale and Agostino were hired by the Cardinal Odardo Farnese to decorate the ceiling of this gallery in his huge Roman palace. He asked them to paint the ceiling with scenes of love based on Ovid's Metamorphoses, to sort of celebrate the marriage of Duke Ranuccio Farnese of Parma to the Pope's niece. So the Carracci have organized this large space using illusionistic devices. We have golden framed easel paintings that seem to sort of stand on an actual cornice within the vault, and overlap painted bronze medallions, which are flanked by these naturalistically rendered nude youthful figures who are dramatically lit from below. The painted framework is supported by stucco-colored sculptures of arms, or sort of plant shafts with human torsos that sort of twist and turn and expose a variety of feelings and expressions. Now, unlike the Carraccis, Caravaggio claimed to ignore the influence of the greats and of antiquity. Instead, he leaned into the Baroque demand for drama and clarity. He painted people he saw in the world around him and worked directly from live models instead of elaborate sketches and notes. He introduced a powerfully frank realism and dramatic theatrical lighting and gestures to Italian Baroque painting. In the 1590s, during his early career, Caravaggio lived with and worked for the art patron Cardinal del Monde. This work, titled Bacchus, from 1595-96, exemplifies his subject matter of this period, which tended to include still life scenes, genre scenes, including compositions that feature card sharps, fortune tellers, and, like this case, glamorous young men dressed as musicians or mythological figures. Here, Caravaggio depicts a youthful, somewhat androgynous figure with red lips and thin, arched eyebrows over heavily lidded eyes, and he seems to sort of offer the viewer this goblet of wine. Now, potentially this is meant to be a young actor in the role of Bacchus, the god of wine, or maybe this is, an illustration of an offer of promiscuity. Notice this still life of rotting fruit in the foreground. This could be included to sort of emphasize the fleeting nature of worldly and sensual pleasures. These things don't last, so maybe Caravaggio is encouraging the viewer to enjoy them while they have them, or maybe he's scolding the viewer to sort of avoid the sins of the flesh. One of Caravaggio's first religious commissions was a set of oil paintings for the Contarelli Chapel in the French church of San Luigi dei Franci, depicting scenes from the life of the chapel's patron saint, Matthew. This work, The Calling of St. Matthew, is probably the best known of these canvases. The subject here is conversion, which was a common counter-Reformation theme. Jesus calls Levi, a Roman tax collector, to join him and his apostles, and Levi converts to Christianity and changes his name to Matthew. So Caravaggio depicts Levi seated at this table with other tax collectors, kind of counting coins, and then Jesus enters from the right behind St. Peter and kind of points dramatically at Levi. We've got this dramatic raking light that comes in from the upper right, which would have appeared like the actual windows above the altar in this church were illuminating this painted scene. Now, apparently, the commissioning document explicitly stated that the artist should show Levi rising from his seat at the table to follow Christ, but Caravaggio has never been one for following all of the rules, and so none of his seated figures rise, and it's a bit ambiguous as to which one Levi or Matthew is supposed to be. Art historians have never really been able to agree. We have the implied diagonal line of the shadow as well as that of Christ's gesture, and then also kind of the implied diagonal of this sword on the hip of this kind of younger man seated in the foreground. And all of these things kind of direct the viewer's eye towards the table and the group of men, but none of the men is really, individually emphasized. Some scholars argue that this bearded man here, who's kind of maybe pointing to himself as if to say, who, me? Some argue that that is Matthew, but others interpret this figure, who is sort of hunched over his coins and kind of seemingly ignoring the arrival of Christ. Some interpret him as being Levi, and they say that this bearded man is actually pointing at him instead of himself. So modern studies have also shown that Caravaggio added this figure of Peter in later, after he had completed the rest of the composition. Now, this choice is made stranger by the fact that Peter is not mentioned in the biblical account of Christ's calling of St. Matthew. Now, maybe Caravaggio has included Peter here because he was the one who took over leadership of the church after Christ's death and sort of served as the first pope. So perhaps this is an allusion to the role of the Catholic Church and the popes in the dissemination of Christ's teachings and the conversion of non-believers. But the mystery surrounding Peter and the sort of ambiguity of, Levi or Matthew, these are very interesting here because they really deny that sense of clarity that the Counter-Reformation called for. Caravaggio was later commissioned for another painting for the Contarelli Chapel, this time to go over the altar, showing St. Matthew writing his gospel with his angelic symbol. He completed the work in 3 months, but when he delivered the painting, it was rejected because the clergy felt his depiction of the saint was unacceptably crude and common. He shows him cross-legged, and they thought that pose was immoral and unnecessarily revealing. And they also thought that this very sort of fleshy angel that's cozied up to the saint was a much too sort of risque interaction. So, in other words, they rejected the painting because it really didn't meet the guidelines of decorum for Christian art that had been established by the Council of Trent. So Caravaggio was forced to paint a second version with a sort of nobler St. Matthew and a more distant angel. Now, the rejected original version was purchased by a Roman collector who also paid for the replacement to ensure that he was the one who received this original, which he felt was more sensational. Now, unfortunately, the original has since been destroyed. It burned after a bombing in Berlin during World War II. So we only know what it looked like based on, reproductions and photographs that had been taken of it. And then this one on the right is the second version, the one that was accepted and the one that hung in the chapel over the altar. This work, The Conversion of St. Paul, is one of 2 paintings commissioned from Caravaggio for the Sorassi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo in 1600. And like his St. Matthew for the Contarelli Chapel, the first pair were rejected upon delivery and later purchased by a private collector. In this second version, Caravaggio's depiction of Paul's conversion is direct and simple. He focuses on Paul's internal involvement in conversion, not the external cause. We don't see Paul's heavenly vision, just his very personal response to it. So Paul is sort of sprawled out on the ground here, having fallen from his horse, and he sort of threatens to tumble out into the viewer's space. His arms are stretched out and his legs are flailing, conveying this sense of tension, and then he's bathed in this very strong spotlight. Now, the large horse that takes up most of the space in the painting has its foot raised and kind of positioned precariously over Paul's torso, as if he might stomp down on the figure at any moment. And then the groomer, who stands just behind the horse, just barely emerges from this very dark, mysterious background, and is really seemingly oblivious to what's happening here. Now, this is a perfect example of how Caravaggio interpreted religious subjects directly and dramatically, combining intensely observed figures, poses, and expressions with strongly contrasting effects of light and color. Here he's utilizing a technique called tenebrism, in which forms emerge from the dark background into a strong light, often from a single source outside the painting, creating this theatrical spotlighting effect that increases the drama of the scene. Caravaggio was held in very high regard by some, especially the younger generations of painters, but he had a violent temper that really got him into trouble quite often. In May of 1606, he murdered a man in a duel over a disputed tennis match, and he had to flee to Rome to escape a death sentence. While on the run, he supported himself by painting in Naples, Sicily, and Malta. The Knights of Malta even awarded him the cross of their religious and military order, but in 1608 he was arrested again after he insulted one of them, but again he escaped and fled. He died in 1610 at the age of 39 years old after he caught a fever on his return trip to Rome, where he expected to be pardoned for his crimes. But it was really his frank realism and dramatic tenebrism that kind of influenced nearly every important European painter in the 17th century. One of Caravaggio's most skilled Italian followers was Artemisia Gentileschi. Now, women didn't have the opportunities for apprenticeships and training like male artists did, but Artemisia's father, Orazio, was a great painter and one of Caravaggio's earliest followers, so she learned a lot from him. In 1616, she moved from Rome to Florence, where she worked for Grand Duke Cosimo II de' Medici, and she was elected at 23 years old to the Florentine Academy of Design. This work, titled Susanna and the Elders, from about 1610, is Artemisia's first attributed work, and this is the focus of the article by Mary Garrard that you have for your reading response this week. Now, this was a common story at the time, taken from the book of Daniel. Susanna, a Hebrew woman, is bathing, and these two elders are spying on her. They try to kind of blackmail her into having sex with them, basically by threatening to ruin her family reputation if she doesn't. And when she refuses, they put her on trial for making false claims. Eventually, though, Susanna is abdicated, and the elders are executed. As Mary Garrard points out in her article, artists typically portrayed Susanna as being either totally unaware of her voyeurs or as being seductive and inviting towards them. But Artemisia Gentileschi tells a much different story. In her version, she depicts a heroic yet naturalistic nude female figure who is beautiful, but she's not really an ideal beauty. She's very fleshy, and we can see rolls of skin along her waist and along her arms, and we can see kind of wrinkles around her neck. And she certainly doesn't ignore or accept the advances of these creepy men, but rather she's twisting kind of awkwardly, showing a sense of vulnerability in her position as she recoils in horror and disgust. And she kind of shows us her anxiety and her fear and a certain sense of shame. So Gentileschi has really portrayed Susanna as a three-dimensional character, not just a beautiful, seductive woman. And she's really trying to emphasize her experience and her plight. Here we have what is probably Gentileschi's most famous work, Judith decapitating Holofernes, or sometimes it's called Judith slaying Holofernes, Judith beheading Holofernes. But this is from 1620, and you can really see how she's taken up Caravaggio's hypernaturalism, tenebrism, and drama. So this was another popular subject for Renaissance and Baroque art, and this time it's drawn from the biblical book of Judith. In the story, Judith is a beautiful Jewish widow whose city of Judah is being invaded by the Assyrian general Holofernes. Judith was so moved by the plight of her people that she risked her life to save them. She charms her way into Holofernes' camp, and when he sees her, he is so taken by her beauty that he immediately invites her to his tent. There he drinks way too much and passes out, and Judith, with the help of her maidservant, uses his own sword to behead him, ultimately saving her people. Now, Gentileschi depicts the most critical moment of the narrative here and really emphasizes the grisly facts of these women's heroism. They sort of physically struggle to hold the general down, while Judith, who is in yellow here, severs his neck and blood spurts out of his jugular vein. Notice how Gentileschi utilizes tenebrism and the sort of convergence of compositional diagonals to move our attention to the most sensational aspects of the scene. Her figures sort of emerge from this incredibly dark background into this strong spotlight that reveals the dramatic struggle. And then we have these various crossing implied lines created by the figure's arms, the man's kind of leg and arms and his torso, maybe even the sword itself, or even the sort of spurting blood here. But all of these lines kind of move our eye towards this kind of central moment of violence, the dramatic focal point here. And they all serve to sort of enhance the tension and dynamism of the scene. Here we have the moment just after the decapitation in which the women are wrapping Holofernes' head in a sack and getting ready to escape. So here we have a single candle that sort of illuminates the scene and really spotlights Judith's tense pose and the bloody sword that she holds in her hand. This sort of adds a sense of danger and urgency and emphasizes the risk and the heightened sense of emotion. Both of these compositions are very theatrical, dramatic, and they both demonstrate figures in very close proximity to the picture plane, which is quite common for Baroque art, and it helps to kind of intensify the scene and to make the viewer feel like they are part of the action. Now, throughout her career, Artemisia Gentileschi painted several images of heroic women, which many scholars have related to her own struggles and experiences as a woman in 17th century Italy. One significant experience seems to relate quite directly to the subject of this composition. In about 1611 or 1612, at the age of 17, Artemisia was raped by a friend of her father and a fellow artist named Agostino Tassi, who had been grooming her for months and promising to marry her as long as she remained silent. Now, at the time, rape was not considered a recognizable offense, and Orazio Gentileschi, Artemisia's father, only really took the case to court after Tassi refused to marry Artemisia. Orazio argued that in, quote, deflowering her, Tassi had dishonored the family and made her unmarriable. Now, at the trial, Artemisia described her struggle against Tassi and her attempt to defend herself with a knife, and also the betrayal of her female chaperone who had agreed to leave her alone with him. The 1620 painting of Judith beheading Holofernes is almost identical in pose to one that she completed around 1611, kind of in that period of her life. But in the 1620 version, Judith has become sort of a self-portrait. She's wearing this golden bracelet that depicts the image of Artemisia's namesake, Artemis, the goddess of chastity and the hunt. And so with this inclusion, the composition becomes sort of a cathartic expression of rage and vengeance, and it's a reflection of Artemisia's experiences as a woman in a male-dominated culture and a male-dominated art world. Your book talks about ceiling painting as the ultimate expression of the Baroque style. These were grand projects, and they were rather complex constructions, including grand illusionistic painting, stucco sculpture, and architectural design. Baroque ceiling painters sought the drama of an immeasurable heaven, and to achieve this, they used a system of quadratura, which literally means kind of grid work or squaring. This technique involves an architectural setting painted in meticulous perspective, usually requiring viewing from a specific point to create the desired effect of soaring space. The most spectacular of these illusionistic Baroque ceilings is Giovanni Battista Galli's The Triumph of the Name of Jesus and Fall of the Damned in the vault of the Jesuit church at Il Gesù, created in 1672 to 85. Now, every element of Galli's creation here is dedicated to the illusion of clouds and angels descending through an opening in the top of the church and into the upper nave. Painted stucco boards extend the composition out of the confined space of the vault and kind of create these dramatic layers over the vault ceiling and make these deep Baroque shadows. We have these tangled masses of extremely foreshortened figures that spill out into the composition, which is sort of focused on this off-center golden heavenly aura that surrounds the letters IHS, which is the monogram of Jesus and the insignia of the Jesuits. If it sort of seems that the light source is emanating from the name of Jesus itself. And so the subject here, kind of overall, is the Last Judgment, with the blessed kind of rising towards the name of God, while the damned kind of spill out and plummet to the floor. And so the sweeping extension of the work into the viewer's space, the strong emotional appearance, the dramatic subject, and the unified multimedia effect are all very Baroque, and this, combined with music and incense during Mass, makes for a very sensual experience.